Picture a time when the skies held no satellites, the seas had no buoys sending data, and the only tools for reading the future were human eyes, intuition, and the accumulated wisdom of generations. This was the world of the Middle Ages, a period often dismissed as dark or backward, yet filled with minds so sharp and observant that they could sense the tremors of an earthquake before the ground shook, or predict a flood before the first drop of rain fell. These medieval scholars operated in an age without technology as we know it, yet their ability to foresee natural disasters remains one of history's most overlooked marvels. How did they do it? What secrets did they uncover simply by watching the world around them with patience and purpose? In this video, we're stepping into their shoes, or rather, their manuscripts and monasteries, to unravel the story of how medieval predictors read nature's subtle signs with nothing but their senses and centuries of inherited knowledge. We'll explore how they turned to the stars for clues, learned to interpret the restless behavior of animals, and even decoded dreams and weather proverbs that carried life-saving insights. This isn't just a tale of superstition or guesswork. It's a testament to human ingenuity, a reminder that long before supercomputers and satellites, people were finding elegant, often astonishingly accurate ways to anticipate the chaos of the natural world. Their methods were a blend of science, spirituality, and sheer attentiveness, a holistic approach that still whispers lessons to us today. So, join us on this journey back through time, where we'll uncover not only how medieval scholars predicted disasters like floods, storms, and earthquakes, but why their legacy matters now more than ever. In an era of climate uncertainty and technological dependency, their story invites us to reconnect with the rhythms of the earth and appreciate the power of observation, intuition, and community wisdom. You're about to discover how the past can illuminate the future, and how sometimes the most advanced tool we have is the one we've always had, our own curiosity. To understand their worldview, we have to step away from our modern perspective. For medieval scholars, the universe was not a random collection of celestial bodies. It was a deeply interconnected, living system. The cosmos above and the earth below were believed to be in constant dialogue, bound by an intricate web of influences. This concept, known as the concept of macrocosm and microcosm, suggested that the movements of the planets and stars directly mirrored and influenced events on a human scale. A disturbance in the heavens wasn't just a distant spectacle, it was a direct telegram about impending earthly affairs. This wasn't mere superstition to them, it was a sophisticated, rational system for understanding a chaotic world. They saw astrology as a natural science, a way to read the divine handwriting in the sky in order to prepare for what was coming. Their tools were the naked eye, meticulous patience, and generations of recorded observations. Astrologers would spend countless hours charting the precise paths of planets, noting their positions in relation to the zodiac constellations. They were particularly attentive to conjunctions, which occur when two or more planets appear to meet in the same part of the sky. A conjunction of Mars and Saturn, for instance, was often interpreted as a portent of conflict, harsh cold, or agricultural failure. These weren't wild guesses, they were deductions based on the perceived nature of the planets themselves. Mars was associated with aggression and heat, Saturn with cold, restriction, and time. By combining these symbolic meanings with their observed positions, astrologers could create surprisingly detailed forecasts. Perhaps the most famous example of this celestial forecasting is the appearance of Halley's comet in 1066. To the people of medieval Europe, This brilliant, unexpected streak across the night sky was not a fascinating astronomical event but a terrifying omen. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a vital historical record from the time, described it as a star with long hair that appeared to be raining blood. Its arrival was almost universally linked to the monumental political and natural upheavals of that year, most notably the Norman invasion of England led by William the Conqueror. The comet was seen as a divine signal of the impending change in rulership and the bloodshed that would follow. But beyond politics, chronicles from across the continent also recorded it as a precursor to a period of severe weather, poor harvests, and widespread unrest, demonstrating how a single celestial event was woven into a narrative of comprehensive disaster. This work was compiled into elaborate, hand-drawn charts known as astrological almanacs or ephemerides. These documents were the complex data models of their day, mapping planetary motions against calendars and listing predicted weather patterns, ideal times for planting, and warnings of potential disasters. An astrologer advising a king might create a geniture, a detailed chart of the celestial conditions at the moment of the monarch's birth, which was then used to predict challenges throughout their reign, including those posed by nature. This blending of what we would now separate into science, politics, and spirituality provided a structured framework for anticipating the unpredictable. It gave communities, from farmers to rulers, a sense of agency, a way to feel prepared even when facing the immense power of nature. While their methods were rooted in a different understanding of physics, their fundamental goal, to use observable patterns to predict and mitigate disaster, is one that still drives scientists today. While the stars offered a grand, celestial map of potential futures, medieval predictors also kept their eyes firmly on the Earth, recognizing that some of the most reliable warnings came from the creatures living alongside them. This was a world deeply intertwined with the animal kingdom, where farmers shared their homes with livestock and communities were acutely aware of the natural rhythms of wildlife. Through this constant, intimate proximity, they began to notice something extraordinary. Animals often seemed to possess a secret knowledge, reacting to unseen threats long before humans could perceive any danger. A sudden, unexplained silence among the birds, the frantic scurrying of mice away from their usual haunts, or the agitated lowing of cattle in their pens, these were not dismissed as random events. They were read as urgent bulletins from the natural world, a sophisticated early warning system written in a language of behavior. One of the most influential minds to study this phenomenon was the German scholar Albertus Magnus, a titan of medieval natural philosophy. In his extensive writings, he meticulously documented cases of animals acting as harbingers of storms, earthquakes, and floods. He theorized that creatures, being more directly connected to and dependent on their environment, were attuned to subtle shifts that eluded human senses. He suggested they could detect faint tremors through the pads of their feet, sense minute changes in air pressure, or smell gases released from fissures deep within the earth long before any visible sign appeared. This wasn't a mystical belief for Magnus. It was a logical conclusion based on empirical observation. He was essentially proposing a form of animal sensory superiority, an idea that modern science now confirms with our understanding of infrasound, electroreception, and olfactory acuity in the animal kingdom. Historical records are filled with chillingly precise accounts that lend credence to these observations. Chronicles from the 14th century, for instance, describe towns in Italy where rats were seen streaming out of cellars and fleeing into the countryside days before a devastating earthquake reduced the buildings to rubble. In coastal communities, fishermen learned to heed the sudden absence of seabirds or the strange tendency of dolphins to swim for deeper waters, interpreting these signs as precursors to a fierce tempest. This knowledge wasn't confined to scholarly texts. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life through folk wisdom and practical proverbs. Rhymes and sayings were passed down through generations, serving as easily remembered guides. A common farmer might not have read Albertus Magnus, but he would certainly know the old adage that when swallows fly low, rain is sure to follow, a behavior now understood as their pursuit of insects driven down by increasing atmospheric pressure. This practice of observing animal behavior represents a fascinating and practical strand of medieval science. It was a method born not from complex instruments, but from profound attentiveness and a humble acknowledgement that humans were not the sole possessors of valuable environmental knowledge. By quietly watching and learning from the creatures around them, medieval people gained a powerful tool for risk mitigation. This collective wisdom, encoded in both learned texts and oral tradition, allowed communities to make critical, life-saving decisions, to drive their flocks to higher ground, to secure their boats extra tightly, or to simply be more vigilant. It was a dialogue with nature, one where humanity learned to listen to the urgent, unspoken warnings of its fellow inhabitants on Earth. While animals provided warnings from the physical world, medieval scholars also turned inward, believing that some of the most urgent messages about impending disasters arrived not through the senses, but through the mysterious realm of sleep. In the Middle Ages, dreams were not considered random neural firings. They were viewed as a profound channel of communication, a way for the divine, or even the natural world itself, to send coded messages about the future. This was a time when the boundary between the waking world and the spiritual one was porous, and a vivid dream could carry the same weight as an observed weather sign. For communities living under the constant threat of famine, flood, or earthquake, interpreting these nocturnal visions became a critical, life-saving skill, blending deep spirituality with a very practical desire to survive. This practice was heavily influenced by classical authorities whose works were preserved and studied in medieval monasteries. Aristotle himself had written on the potential prophetic nature of dreams in his works, On Divination in Sleep and On Dreams, suggesting that during sleep, the soul might be more receptive to subtle impressions from the environment or from a higher plane. Even more impactful was the work of St. Augustine, whose writings in The City of God and his Confessions grappled with the nature of divine communication. He described dreams as a potential vehicle for God to send warnings or guidance to the faithful, though he also cautioned against superstitious obsession. These philosophical foundations gave medieval dream interpretation a layer of intellectual credibility. It wasn't mere folk magic, but a subject worthy of scholarly analysis and debate. Monks and scribes, often the most literate members of society, became the custodians of this knowledge. They meticulously compiled dream dictionaries, known as somnialia, which functioned as decryption manuals for the subconscious. These texts provided standardized interpretations for common symbols that might foretell natural upheaval. Dreaming of raging, muddy waters wasn't just an anxiety about a river. It was a specific omen of a coming flood that could wash away homes and crops. A vision of a mountain crumbling or shaking violently was interpreted as a direct precursor to an earthquake. Even dreaming of a tree being struck by lightning could be read as a warning of a sudden, devastating storm. These interpretations were disseminated from the monastery scriptorium to the village square, ensuring that a farmer's troubling dream could be brought to the local priest for a potentially life-saving analysis. Perhaps the most famous example of this blend of mystical vision and practical prediction is the remarkable Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, composer, and polymath. From a very young age, Hildegard experienced powerful, luminous visions that she described as seeing the shadow of the living light. These were not passive dreams but active, waking revelations filled with complex, often terrifying imagery. She documented these visions in elaborate detail in works like Sivier's Know the Ways, describing swirling celestial forces, burning mountains, and tempestuous seas. While her primary focus was on theological and moral reform, her visions were also filled with ecological warnings. She spoke of corrupt air, failing crops, and natural disasters as consequences of human sin, but her descriptions were so vivid that they were often taken as literal forecasts. Leaders, including popes and emperors, sought her counsel, believing her insights could help them prepare their realms for both spiritual and natural trials. Her work demonstrates how seamlessly the medieval mind connected the moral and the meteorological, seeing a famine or a flood as both a physical event and a divine message. The impact of these dream interpretations extended far beyond personal curiosity. They directly influenced community action and even royal policy. There are accounts from English chronicles of entire villages deciding to delay a harvest or move their livestock to higher ground because a respected elder had a recurring dream of submerged fields. In more than one instance, a nobleman's frightening dream was presented to a king's council as evidence to support fortifying a town's defenses against an anticipated harsh winter or preparing storehouses for a coming shortage. The decision was not made on the dream alone, of course, but it was considered a valuable data point in a world with limited information. Another piece of the predictive puzzle that included animal behavior, weather signs, and astrological charts. This willingness to act on intuitive, subconscious information highlights a holistic approach to knowledge that modern society, with its reliance on quantifiable data, has largely left behind. This fusion of what we would now separate into psychology and prophecy reveals the incredible creativity of the medieval approach to prediction. They were essentially early cartographers of the human subconscious, mapping its symbolic language onto the physical world in an attempt to find order in chaos. They understood that the mind, in its quietest states, might perceive connections or sense impending shifts that conscious observation could miss. While their methods may seem unscientific today, their underlying impulse, to use every available tool, both external and internal, to safeguard their communities, was deeply rational. It was a testament to their resilience and their relentless quest for meaning, ensuring that even the world of dreams was enlisted in the vital effort to read the future and survive it. While dreams offered a glimpse into the subconscious and animals provided silent alarms, another powerful predictive tool was spoken aloud daily in fields, villages, and on the decks of ships. This was the world of weather lore, a vast and sophisticated collection of proverbs and rhymes that encoded centuries of observational wisdom into simple, memorable phrases. Think of it as the medieval internet, a decentralized, orally transmitted database of environmental data, constantly updated and verified by generations of lived experience. A farmer scanning the horizon didn't need a complex instrument. He had the words of his grandfather and the collective memory of his community, all condensed into a few potent lines. These sayings were far more than old wives' tales. They were the result of relentless, meticulous attention to the natural world, a way to spot patterns in the chaos of weather and anticipate its next move. This knowledge was so valuable that medieval scholars, those keen compilers of information, eagerly gathered these proverbs into manuscripts and early printed books. Figures like the English monk Bede in his work, The Reckoning of Time, and later encyclopedists included entire chapters dedicated to forecasting weather based on wind, clouds, and the behavior of the sun and moon. They systematically noted that certain cloud formations, like high, wispy cirrus clouds, foretold a change in weather within the next 24 hours, while low, heavy nimbostratus clouds signaled imminent rain. They categorized winds not just by direction but by their character. A warm, gentle southerly wind might promise good growing weather, while a sharp, biting northeasterly was often a harbinger of storms and cold snaps. This wasn't guesswork, it was a proto-scientific method of classification based on repeatable observations. The famous proverb, "Red sky at night, sailor's delight, red sky in morning, sailor's warning," is a perfect example of this empirical genius. We now understand the science behind it. A red sky at sunset is caused by sunlight scattering off dust and other particles in a stable, high-pressure air mass approaching from the west, which typically brings fair weather. A red sky in the morning, however, means that same high-pressure system has already passed, and the rising sun is illuminating the leading edge of a low-pressure system, and its associated clouds and moisture moving in from the east, signaling rough weather ahead. Medieval predictors didn't know the physics of light scattering, but through countless observations, they perfectly correlated the visual cue with the weather outcome, creating a reliable rule that is still used today. Without barometers to measure air pressure, they developed a whole bodily science of detection. A sudden, aching pain in an old wound or a feeling of listlessness and headache among a community could signal a rapid drop in pressure preceding a major storm. They were, in effect, using their own bodies as living barometers, attuned to the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. The natural world provided other instruments. They observed that pine cones remained tightly closed and marigolds shut their petals when humidity was high, a sign that rain was likely. Seaweed becoming dry and brittle was a sign of continuing fair weather, while if it felt damp and limp, it was absorbing moisture from the air, indicating rain was on the way. This hyper-awareness of their environment turned every flower, every tree, and every twinge in a sailor's knee into a potential data point. For the people whose lives and livelihoods depended on the whims of nature, this law was not a quaint tradition, it was a critical survival tool. A farmer hearing the rhyme, "When the wind is in the east, 'tis neither good for man nor beast," would know to shelter his animals and delay planting delicate seeds. A sailor seeing a halo around the moon, knowing the saying, "A ring around the moon means rain or snow soon," would think twice about setting out to sea. These proverbs enabled rapid, life-saving decision-making based on a shared cultural knowledge base. This vast body of collective observation, passed down through catchy, easy-to-remember verses, represents one of the most successful and enduring applications of human intuition to the problem of prediction, laying the essential groundwork for the scientific field of meteorology that would follow. Just as they learned to read the language of the winds and the warnings in their dreams, medieval scholars also turned their gaze upward to a celestial timekeeper they believed governed the very pulse of the earth, the moon. Its predictable, rhythmic dance across the night sky offered a framework for understanding the more violent and unpredictable rhythms of the planet below. They observed with meticulous care that the ocean's tides seemed to breathe in time with the lunar phases, swelling to their greatest heights during the full and new moons, a phenomenon we now call spring tides. But their curiosity didn't stop at the water's edge. They theorized that if the moon's invisible force could move entire oceans, it could surely stir the very foundations of the earth and churn the atmosphere above it. This wasn't a fringe belief, it was a central tenet of their natural philosophy, a logical extension of their view of a deeply interconnected cosmos. One of the most influential voices championing this lunar-centric view was the Venerable Bede, an 8th century English monk and one of the greatest scholars of the early Middle Ages. In his foundational work, The Reckoning of Time, Bede dedicated significant effort to explaining the mechanics of tides, directly linking their ebb and flow to the moon's position and phase. He described how the moon's gravitational pull, though he would not have used that term, exerted an influence on all earthly waters. But Bede and his contemporaries took this observation a dramatic step further. They reasoned that this same celestial force that pulled on the sea must also act upon the subterranean waters and even the pockets of air trapped within the earth. They believed that during the heightened pull of a full or new moon, this pressure could become so immense that it would literally trigger the ground to shake, unleashing earthquakes, or force ancient underground reservoirs to rupture, leading to sudden floods or the mysterious drying up of wells far from the coast. This understanding transformed the lunar calendar from a simple religious and agricultural guide into a vital tool for disaster preparedness. In coastal monasteries, scribes would carefully note the dates of upcoming spring tides. They knew that a high spring tide combined with a powerful storm surge from the North Sea could be catastrophic, overwhelming seawalls and flooding low-lying villages. Based on these lunar predictions, abbots or local lords might order the reinforcement of dikes or advise fishermen to secure their boats extra tightly days in advance. Riverine communities situated along inland waterways like the Rhine or the Thames also used this knowledge. They understood that a high lunar tide could block the normal flow of a river, causing it to back up and overflow its banks miles inland. A warning would circulate, prompting farmers to move their livestock to higher ground and to move their stored grain to the upper floors of their barns. This was proactive community defense orchestrated by the phases of the moon. Of course, by our modern scientific standards, their understanding was incomplete. We now know that while the moon's gravity does exert a small stress on the Earth's crust, it is not a primary trigger for major seismic events. Earthquakes are caused by the release of stress built up from the movement of tectonic plates, a concept entirely unknown to the medieval mind. Yet, the fascinating truth is that modern research has found a slight statistical correlation between lunar cycles and very small, shallow earthquakes, as the extra gravitational stress can be the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back on an already strained fault line. In this way, the medieval predictors were not entirely wrong. They were simply interpreting a subtle, complex geophysical relationship through the lens of the knowledge available to them. What remains so impressive is the sophistication of their attempt to quantify nature's rhythms without a single instrument. They had no seismographs, no tidal gauges, no satellites. All they had was patience, meticulous record-keeping over generations, and a powerful drive to find order in a seemingly chaotic natural world. Their lunar theories represent a brilliant, if imperfect, model, a testament to the human intellect's need to create systems of understanding. They correctly identified a powerful celestial driver of earthly events, the tides, and then used that template to explore other mysteries, from trembling ground to erratic weather. Their legacy is a powerful reminder that the connection between the moon and our planet is both profound and enduring, a gravitational dance that they observed with awe and utilized with remarkable ingenuity. But the Earth itself held secrets far closer to the surface, offering clues not in the distant stars or in animal behavior, but in the very ground beneath their feet and the water drawn from its depths. For communities living in seismically active regions, like those nestled in the valleys of the Alps or along the rocky coasts of Italy, the local well was more than just a source of water. It was a vital instrument, a living barometer for the health of the land. Generations of careful observation taught them that when the normally clear, cool water from a deep well suddenly turned cloudy, warm, or developed a strange sulfuric taste, it was not merely an oddity to be ignored. It was a potential emergency signal, a direct message from the subterranean world that something profound and likely dangerous was shifting deep below. These hydrological anomalies were recorded with grave seriousness in monastic chronicles, which served as the scientific logbooks of the era. The monks of a monastery near a major fault line would note the exact date the well water changed, and later, when a tremor shook the very foundations of their chapel, they would meticulously add that event to the record, creating a growing body of evidence that linked the two phenomena. This was a form of practical, empirical science born from absolute necessity. Without any understanding of plate tectonics or the complex mechanics of seismic waves, they nonetheless correctly identified a reliable correlation. We now know the precise science behind their observations. In the days or hours before an earthquake, the immense pressure building along a fault line can force microscopic particles of rock and sediment up from deep underground into the water table, clouding the water in wells and springs. That same pressure can heat the surrounding rock, subtly warming the groundwater. Furthermore, the stress can release gases like radon or sulfur dioxide from within the earth, which dissolve into the water, giving it that distinct, off-putting taste and smell. Their senses were detecting the literal breath of the planet, the exhalation of pent-up geological stress. Their vigilance extended beyond the water itself. Shepherds tending flocks on high mountain pastures and farmers plowing their fields were often the first to notice other, more visible signs. They reported strange, new cracks appearing in the dry earth for no apparent reason, or patches of ground that inexplicably felt warm to the touch. There were accounts of a low, mist-like vapor or a faint, foul odor, often described as the smell of rotten eggs rising from fissures in the ground. Some medieval texts even describe the mysterious appearance of new, small ponds or the sudden drying up of established ones, as underground aquifers were blocked or rerouted by the shifting geology. All of these signs were interpreted as evidence of the Earth's internal pressures reaching a breaking point, a concept they might have explained in terms of the planet's humors being out of balance or underground winds struggling to escape, but which was fundamentally a correct observation of cause and effect. This knowledge was not confined to scholarly texts. It was embedded in the oral traditions of every village. Folk wisdom was passed down through generations in the form of stark warnings. An elder might caution a younger person to never ignore a well that suddenly went bad, or to immediately report any strange smells from a familiar field. This collective awareness meant that an entire community could become a distributed sensor network. A single observation from one farmer about his well could trigger a chain reaction of vigilance, prompting others to check their own water sources and share their findings. In some documented cases, this grassroots early warning system provided just enough time for a village to move to safer ground, or to secure their most valuable possessions before the ground shook. The sophistication of this approach lies in its elegant simplicity. They used what was immediately available to them, their water, their land, and their own sharp senses to monitor the planet's stability. While they lacked our technical vocabulary, their practical understanding was remarkably acute. They recognized that the Earth was not a static, unmoving foundation, but a dynamic, sometimes unstable, force that communicated its distress through subtle yet perceptible signals. By learning to listen to this terrestrial language, these medieval predictors developed a powerful and often life-saving form of environmental awareness, demonstrating that the most advanced technology for understanding the world begins with paying close attention to it. Yet, even as they read the signs in wells and watched the behavior of animals, the medieval mind was navigating a far more profound and complex landscape of meaning. To truly understand their predictions, we must step into their worldview, where a flood or an earthquake was never just a physical event, it was a message. For medieval societies steeped in religious faith and a powerful sense of divine order, natural disasters were overwhelmingly interpreted as acts of God. They were divine punishments for collective sin, tests of faith for the righteous, or dire warnings urging repentance and moral reform. This wasn't a simplistic or superstitious view. It was a comprehensive theological framework that provided a compelling explanation for suffering and chaos. It shaped every aspect of how disasters were predicted, prepared for, and ultimately experienced, weaving spiritual significance into the very fabric of daily survival. The clergy, often the most educated figures in a community, were the primary interpreters of these divine messages. When a series of storms destroyed crops or a sudden plague swept through a town, people didn't just look for a physical cause. They turned to their priests and monks to discern what sin had provoked God's wrath. They used a powerful biblical lens to understand their plight. The story of Noah's Ark was not merely an ancient tale. It was a direct precedent and a sobering lesson. It taught that God could and would use catastrophic flooding to cleanse a corrupt world, but it also offered a promise. Those who were vigilant and righteous would be given a warning and a means of salvation. This narrative encouraged a state of constant watchfulness for omens, transforming every unusual weather pattern, every comet, and every strange animal birth into a potential spiritual signifier. Predicting a disaster, therefore, became a deeply moral act. It was about reading God's will in the natural world to save not just lives but souls. This fusion of prophecy and practicality reached its peak in the work of apocalyptic thinkers like the 12th century Italian abbot Joachim of Fiore. His complex and influential writings, which divided history into three grand ages, were filled with vivid prophecies of impending doom and renewal. He predicted great tribulations, including natural catastrophes, that would precede a new age of the Holy Spirit. While his visions were mystical, their impact was intensely practical. His ideas spread like wildfire across Europe, shaping public consciousness and creating a widespread cultural expectation that great upheavals were coming. For a population living through the political instability, famines, and plagues of the later Middle Ages, these prophecies didn't just make sense of current suffering, they provided a timeline for the future. This encouraged communities to engage in both spiritual and tangible preparation, to seek forgiveness, to pray, but also to store food, reinforce buildings, and be ready for the tumult foretold by a revered holy man. This cultural framework meant that a prediction was never a neutral piece of data. It was a call to action that operated on two simultaneous levels. On one hand, it was a practical warning to take concrete steps, to build a dike to store extra grain or to evacuate a valley. On the other, and just as importantly, it was a moral imperative urging repentance, prayer, and community solidarity. A forecast of a harsh winter would prompt a village not only to gather firewood, but also to hold special masses and charity drives for the poor. This holistic approach to disaster management fostered incredible social cohesion. Facing a perceived divine judgment, communities were often driven to resolve internal conflicts, forgive debts, and care for their most vulnerable members, strengthening the social fabric exactly when it was about to be tested most severely. The prediction of a physical disaster became a catalyst for spiritual and social renewal. Understanding this rich context is essential. It allows us to see that the medieval predictor was not simply a primitive scientist. He was often a scholar, a priest, or a monk acting as a bridge between the material and the spiritual worlds. His predictions were a synthesis of observed natural signs and deep theological interpretation, all aimed at guiding his community through both physical and spiritual peril. This approach, which seems so foreign to our modern, secularized view of risk, offered a powerful tool for coping with the terrifying randomness of nature. It provided meaning, purpose, and a clear path forward in the face of chaos. Their methods show us that sometimes the most effective way to prepare for a disaster is to believe that surviving it matters on a level that transcends the physical world. This profound integration of faith and foresight provided a resilience that was about more than just enduring a storm. It was about affirming a cosmic order, even in the midst of its most violent corrections. While interpreting signs in nature and the heavens provided one form of foresight, medieval scholars also turned to a more tangible and systematic source of wisdom: the written records of the past. In the scriptoriums of monasteries and the halls of noble courts, scribes performed a vital, painstaking duty. They were the data keepers of their age, meticulously compiling chronicles known as annals. These were not simply dry lists of kings and battles. They were rich, detailed logs of daily life and death, where the true drama often played out in the entries describing the weather. A monk's hand would carefully record the year the winter froze the Thames solid enough for a festival to be held upon it, the summer when the rain never ceased and the wheat rotted in the fields, or the specific night the earth shook so violently it cracked the stone walls of the abbey itself. These annals became a vast communal memory bank, a centuries-long dataset of environmental catastrophe and recovery. This was more than just archiving, it was active, analytical research. Medieval predictors, often these very same monks or scholars hired by local lords, would pore over these old parchments looking not for unique events, but for repeating patterns. They were searching for the rhythm of disaster. By comparing entries across decades or even centuries, they might notice that severe droughts seemed to strike their region roughly every 70 years, or that a specific configuration of planetary movements had preceded a series of harsh winters in the past. They were essentially practicing an early form of data science, identifying cycles and correlations within historical records to build predictive models for the future. A period of unseasonably warm winters and wet springs noted in an old chronicle could serve as a template, a historical precedent that, when observed again in the present, would trigger a warning of potential famine. A powerful and tragic example of this is found in the records surrounding the Great Famine of 1315. Chronicles from across Europe, such as the Winchester Chronicle in England, provide a chillingly precise timeline. The annalists noted that the years leading up to the catastrophe were marked by profoundly strange and persistent weather patterns, years of heavy, relentless rainfall and unusually cold temperatures that began as early as 1314. These entries were not written with the benefit of hindsight, they were contemporary observations. A scholar living in 1315, consulting these very annals, might have seen a similar pattern described 100 years earlier in a time of great hardship. This historical echo would have been a terrifying and powerful clue, allowing a forward-thinking ruler or community leader to anticipate crop failure and begin the difficult work of importing grain or rationing supplies before the first person went hungry. The record of the past became a manual for surviving the future. This archival approach reveals a profound and often overlooked aspect of the medieval mindset, a deep reverence for history and a firm belief that the past held the keys to the future. They understood that nature operated on long cycles that outstripped a single human lifespan. A farmer might only see one devastating flood in his lifetime, but the monastery's library held accounts of 3 or 4 such events, revealing the pattern that was invisible to any one person. This commitment to preserving and studying these records underscores a remarkable institutional dedication to long-term thinking and collective security. The patient work of the scribe, diligently recording the weather each year, was an act of faith, a belief that this knowledge would one day serve, protect, and warn generations yet unborn. In their dusty scrolls and heavy ledgers, they were building the first early warning system based not on omen but on evidence. Beyond the carefully penned chronicles of monks and the complex charts of astrologers, there existed another, far more intimate library of predictive knowledge, one that lived not on parchment, but in the memories and spoken words of everyday people. This was the world of anecdotal evidence and oral tradition, a vibrant and dynamic network of shared experience that turned every elder, every seasoned traveler, and every survivor of a past disaster into a living repository of vital information. In an age where literacy was a privilege of the few, this was how the majority of humanity preserved its hard-won wisdom. A grandmother's story about the eerie calm that settled over the village before the great flood of her youth, or a sailor's harrowing tale of the strange, glowing water that warned him of a monstrous storm. These were not mere campfire stories. They were data points, carefully filed away in the collective consciousness of a community, ready to be recalled and cross-referenced when the world began to act strangely once more. Recognizing the immense value of this grassroots intelligence, medieval scholars became not just theorists, but avid collectors of these lived experiences. They acted as early anthropologists, journeying to ports, visiting markets, and interviewing farmers, shepherds, and midwives to gather their stories. These anecdotes were then meticulously compiled into massive encyclopedic works and natural histories, transforming fleeting spoken words into a permanent, scholarly record. A text like the De Proprietatibus Rerum on the Properties of Things by Bartholomeus Anglicus, a 13th century Franciscan monk, is a perfect example. It functioned as a comprehensive summary of all knowledge of the natural world, and within its pages, first-hand accounts from common people sat comfortably alongside the theories of Aristotle and Augustine. A traveler's description of birds fleeing a particular valley days before a landslide would be recorded with the same seriousness as a theological argument, because its practical utility was beyond question. One particularly fascinating example that often appeared in these collections was the sailor's account of a sea of fire or a glowing wake. What these mariners were describing, though they lacked the term, was bioluminescence, the eerie blue-green light emitted by vast blooms of marine plankton when disturbed. Through painful experience, seasoned sailors learned that an intense, widespread display of this phenomenon often preceded the arrival of a powerful storm. The scientific explanation, unknown to them, is that the same deep ocean currents that stir up the bioluminescent organisms from the depths are also often the precursors to major shifts in weather patterns that bring violent winds and waves. For a medieval scholar compiling a book on weather signs, a dozen independent accounts from different sailors, all describing the same visual cue before a tempest, was compelling evidence. It was a reliable correlation, verified by repeat observation, and thus worthy of being enshrined as a predictive rule. This process of gathering and validating oral testimony created a powerful feedback loop between the educated elite and the practical knowledge of the common folk. It was a truly collaborative form of science. The scholar provided the framework, the permanence of the written word, and the authority to give these observations weight beyond their village. In return, the farmer, the sailor, and the shepherd provided the raw data, the countless hours of direct, unbroken observation that a cloistered monk could never have access to. This system ensured that the wisdom of the illiterate was never lost. A clever piece of weather lore coined by a farmer who could not sign his own name could, through this process, end up saving the lives of thousands by being included in a text read by a duke or a bishop making decisions for an entire region. The mechanism for this dissemination was the oral tradition itself, a robust and sophisticated technology for information storage and transmission. Knowledge was encoded in easily remembered rhymes, proverbs, and cautionary tales, designed to be passed down flawlessly from parent to child over generations. A saying like, "When the ditch smells of foulness and the frog changes his hole, expect a shake in the earth," is specific, vivid, and unforgettable. It packages a complex observation about hydrogen sulfide gas release and animal behavior into a simple, actionable warning. In the town square, at the village well, or during long winter nights, these stories and sayings were shared and reaffirmed, constantly sharpened by new experiences. This created a communal early warning system where everyone, regardless of their social status or education, could participate in safeguarding their community. It was a profound expression of shared responsibility, a testament to the idea that the key to survival was not held by any one person, but was woven into the very stories a community told about itself and its past. And just as they learned to listen to the whispers of the earth and the warnings of the animal kingdom, medieval observers also turned their attention to the silent, steadfast world of plants, discovering that gardens and forests held a secret language all their own. They recognized that flora was not merely a passive feature of the landscape but a deeply sensitive barometer, reacting to the subtlest shifts in the environment long before those changes became apparent to humans. An orchard blooming weeks too early, the leaves of a familiar tree curling and wilting without cause, or the sudden, premature dropping of fruit, these were not seen as simple quirks of nature. To the medieval eye, trained by generations of agricultural dependence, these botanical anomalies were urgent dispatches, a silent alarm system woven into the very roots and branches of the living world. This deep botanical wisdom was heavily informed by and recorded in influential texts like the Physiologus, an ancient work of natural history that was widely copied and commented upon throughout the Middle Ages. This book and others like it didn't just describe plants, it assigned them meanings and behaviors linked to larger cosmic and environmental truths. It taught that the natural world was symbolic, that a plant's appearance and actions could reveal hidden realities about the health of the land and the forces acting upon it. Medieval herbalists and monks, often the caregivers and healers of their communities, studied these texts and then combined that scholarly knowledge with relentless, hands-on observation in their monastery gardens and the surrounding woodlands. These spaces became their living laboratories, outdoor classrooms where they could monitor growth patterns, note flowering times, and observe how different species responded to changes in weather, soil, and even subterranean activity. Some of their most astute observations centered on the behavior of trees before seismic events. Chronicles from regions prone to earthquakes, such as parts of Italy and Greece, contain accounts of entire groves of trees shedding their leaves out of season days before a major tremor. We now understand the likely science behind this. The immense stress building along a fault line can release gases like radon and create minor changes in the local electric field or groundwater levels. Trees, with their vast root systems acting like underground antennae, are exquisitely sensitive to these shifts. The stress can cause them to go into a form of shock, leading to accelerated leaf loss. What medieval observers interpreted as the tree fleeing its leaves or preparing for a blow was actually a sophisticated physiological response to geological distress signals that they could not otherwise perceive. This knowledge was immediately translated into practical, life-saving advice for farmers and entire communities. A herbalist noticing that the moss on the north side of trees was unusually dry might warn of an impending drought, advising villagers to begin conserving water. The observation that certain flowers, like marigolds or tulips, remained tightly closed in the morning when they would normally be open was read as a sure sign of coming rain, as the plants were responding to the increased humidity in the air. This wasn't just folk magic, it was a form of early bioindication, using living organisms to monitor environmental conditions. A farmer's decision to delay the wheat harvest or to prioritize planting drought-resistant crops could hinge on the message carried in the droop of a leaf or the timing of a blossom. This profound botanical awareness represents a beautiful synthesis of the medieval worldview. It blended the practical, hands-on knowledge essential for survival with a more philosophical sense of humanity's deep connection to the natural world. They saw themselves not as separate from nature but as a part of a single, interconnected whole, where every plant, animal, and human was in constant communication. A wilting vine was a neighbor in distress, and a prematurely falling leaf was a word in a conversation they were striving to understand. Their legacy is a powerful reminder that long before we had electronic sensors and satellite data, we had a world brimming with natural indicators. The key to prediction wasn't always about building a better tool. Sometimes it was simply about learning to see, to listen, and to understand the ancient, silent language of the living world around us. But while they became masters of reading the wind's immediate message, medieval scholars also had to grapple with natural events of a far grander and more terrifying scale phenomena, whose origins were thousands of miles away, yet whose consequences landed squarely on their doorsteps. They observed that sometimes, even with favorable winds and clear skies, the world could suddenly turn cold and dark. Summers would fail, crops would wither under a strange, hazy sun, and an unshakable chill would linger for months or even years. Without any concept of global climate systems or plate tectonics, they struggled to explain these devastating periods, often recorded in chronicles as years without summer. Yet through careful observation and a growing network of information, they began to connect these local calamities to distant, earth-shattering explosions they could not see, massive volcanic eruptions. One of the most profound examples and a key piece of this predictive puzzle was the colossal eruption of the Samalas volcano in Indonesia in 1257. This event, one of the most powerful of the last 10,000 years, was utterly unknown by name to Europeans, but its effects were felt in every village and farm across the continent. Medieval chroniclers from London to Paris to Cologne left behind strikingly consistent accounts. They wrote of the sun becoming pale and weak, its light unable to cast a shadow even at noon. They described a persistent, gritty haze that stained the sky a dull copper color and left a strange dusting on windowsills. Most catastrophically, they documented the years of relentless cold and rain that followed, leading to widespread crop failure, famine, and social unrest. A monk in England might not have known what caused the bitter cold of 1258, but by carefully recording the atmospheric anomalies that preceded it, the strange skies and the dimmed sun, he was unknowingly creating a template. The next time a similar haze descended and the sunlight grew feeble, a scholar consulting these old records could make a terrifyingly accurate prediction: hard times are coming. Prepare for famine. These distant volcanic events were almost universally interpreted through a powerful cultural and religious lens. The pervasive layer of ash high in the atmosphere, which caused the spectacular sunsets and the cooling effect, was seen as anything but natural. To the medieval eye, a blood-red sun or a sky that seemed to weep a fine, sulphurous dust were clear signs of divine displeasure. The smell of sulfur that sometimes accompanied these events, carried on the wind from unimaginable distances, was particularly potent. It was immediately associated with biblical descriptions of hellfire and divine judgment, the smell of God's wrath made manifest on earth. This interpretation wasn't just superstitious fear, it directly influenced the predictive response. A prediction based on these signs wasn't merely a call to store grain. It was an urgent summons for communal prayer, repentance, and moral reckoning. The disaster was both physical and spiritual, and the preparation had to address both realms to be considered complete. This developing understanding, however flawed, revealed a remarkable early grasp of global interconnectedness. They observed that an event in a far-off, unknown land could trigger a chain reaction that altered the climate of their entire world. By painstakingly recording the sequence of events, first the atmospheric oddities, then the climatic shift, and finally the human-suffering medieval predictors were building the first models of how a catastrophe in one part of the globe could ripple across continents. They may have explained it as the finger of God tracing a path of judgment across the world, but the practical outcome was the same, a recognition that they lived in a world where danger could arrive silently on the wind, from a place beyond their maps, demanding a vigilance that was both global in its awareness and local in its action. This profound, if nascent, global perspective highlights their relentless drive to find cause and effect in a seemingly chaotic universe, pushing the boundaries of their knowledge to protect their communities from threats they could not see and barely dared to imagine. While they became masters of reading the wind's immediate message, medieval scholars also had to grapple with natural events of a far grander and more terrifying scale, phenomena whose origins were thousands of miles away, yet whose consequences landed squarely on their doorsteps. They observed that sometimes, even with favorable winds and clear skies, the world could suddenly turn cold and dark. Summers would fail, crops would wither under a strange, hazy sun, and an unshakable chill would linger for months or even years. Without any concept of global climate systems or plate tectonics, they struggled to explain these devastating periods, often recorded in chronicles as years without summer. Yet through careful observation and a growing network of information, they began to connect these local calamities to distant, earth-shattering explosions they could not see, massive volcanic eruptions. One of the most profound examples and a key piece of this predictive puzzle was the colossal eruption of the Samalas volcano in Indonesia in 1257. This event, one of the most powerful of the last 10,000 years, was utterly unknown by name to Europeans, but its effects were felt in every village and farm across the continent. Medieval chroniclers from London to Paris to Cologne left behind strikingly consistent accounts. They wrote of the sun becoming pale and weak, its light unable to cast a shadow even at noon. They described a persistent, gritty haze that stained the sky a dull copper color and left a strange dusting on windowsills. Most catastrophically, they documented the years of relentless cold and rain that followed, leading to widespread crop failure, famine, and social unrest. A monk in England might not have known what caused the bitter cold of 1258, but by carefully recording the atmospheric anomalies that preceded it, the strange skies and the dimmed sun, he was unknowingly creating a template. The next time a similar haze descended and the sunlight grew feeble, a scholar consulting these old records could make a terrifyingly accurate prediction: hard times are coming. Prepare for famine. These distant volcanic events were almost universally interpreted through a powerful cultural and religious lens. The pervasive layer of ash high in the atmosphere, which caused the spectacular sunsets and the cooling effect, was seen as anything but natural. To the medieval eye, a blood-red sun or a sky that seemed to weep a fine, sulphurous dust were clear signs of divine displeasure. The smell of sulfur that sometimes accompanied these events, carried on the wind from unimaginable distances, was particularly potent. It was immediately associated with biblical descriptions of hellfire and divine judgment, the smell of God's wrath made manifest on earth. This interpretation wasn't just superstitious fear, it directly influenced the predictive response. A prediction based on these signs wasn't merely a call to store grain. It was an urgent summons for communal prayer, repentance, and moral reckoning. The disaster was both physical and spiritual, and the preparation had to address both realms to be considered complete. This developing understanding, however flawed, revealed a remarkable early grasp of global interconnectedness. They observed that an event in a far-off, unknown land could trigger a chain reaction that altered the climate of their entire world. By painstakingly recording the sequence of events, first the atmospheric oddities, then the climatic shift, and finally the human-suffering medieval predictors were building the first models of how a catastrophe in one part of the globe could ripple across continents. They may have explained it as the finger of God tracing a path of judgment across the world, but the practical outcome was the same, a recognition that they lived in a world where danger could arrive silently on the wind, from a place beyond their maps, demanding a vigilance that was both global in its awareness and local in its action. This profound, if nascent, global perspective highlights their relentless drive to find cause and effect in a seemingly chaotic universe, pushing the boundaries of their knowledge to protect their communities from threats they could not see and barely dared to imagine. This deep connection to the seasons was formalized and given structure through one of the most ingenious and beautiful tools of the medieval world, the seasonal calendar. Far more than a simple way to mark the days, these calendars, most famously depicted in the labors of the month cycles found in illuminated manuscripts and church sculptures, were comprehensive visual guides to the entire rhythm of life and risk. Each month was personified not by a number, but by a specific, essential task: January by a figure feasting by the fire, June by a farmer scything hay, October by the pressing of wine. But embedded within these seemingly straightforward scenes was a wealth of predictive wisdom. They were mnemonic devices, easy-to-remember illustrations that encoded generations of knowledge about what weather to expect, what disasters might loom, and what precise actions were required to survive and thrive. The creators of these calendars were master synthesizers, weaving together threads from astronomy, agriculture, and folklore into a single, cohesive system. They meticulously tracked the solstices and equinoxes, understanding these astronomical milestones as the fundamental hinges of the year, the points where the balance of light and dark shifted, and with it, the behavior of the natural world. But they also layered this celestial data with the rhythm of the liturgical calendar. Feast days like Candlemas in February or Michaelmas in September weren't just religious observances. They were critical market days, settlement dates for rents, and most importantly, reliable seasonal markers. The wisdom held that if the weather was fair on St. Swithin's Day in mid-July, it would remain so for 40 days, but if it rained, the downpour would continue. This wasn't mere superstition. It was a shorthand for recognizing the typical stability of summer weather patterns. This integration of knowledge created a powerful framework for anticipation. A calendar entry for early spring wouldn't just show a farmer pruning vines. It would implicitly warn of the potential for a late frost that could kill new buds, advising him to wait for a specific phase of the moon or until after a particular saint's day. The depiction of autumn showed the slaughtering of livestock and the salting of meat, a direct instruction to prepare for the lean months ahead, and a reminder that early snows could isolate a community, making fresh meat unavailable. For a coastal community, the calendar for late autumn might visually emphasize the securing of boats, a warning of the fierce gales that traditionally arrived around the time of the feast of St. Martin in November. These calendars turned time itself into a map, with known hazards clearly marked along the way. The predictive power of this system was its emphasis on cyclical thinking. By understanding that time was not linear but circular, that the challenges of one season would inevitably return in the next year, medieval communities were psychologically and practically primed for preparedness. A late thaw one April, which led to a shortened growing season and a scarce harvest, became a lesson etched into the communal memory. The following year, if the snows lingered too long again, it wasn't seen as a unique event but as a pattern repeating. This would trigger a pre-planned response, the immediate rationing of stored grain, the seeking of alternative food sources like foraging or fishing, and perhaps the decision to plant hardier, fast-growing crops like rye instead of wheat. The calendar provided the template, and lived experience provided the trigger for action. This profound awareness of nature's cycles fostered a culture of resilience built on adaptation. You didn't try to fight the seasons, you learned to dance with them, to anticipate their every step. The seasonal calendar was the choreography for that dance, a guide that taught flexibility and foresight. It ensured that the knowledge of how to survive a drought, a flood, or a brutal winter wasn't lost with one generation but was instead passed down, visually and verbally, becoming a permanent part of a community's identity. This wasn't about predicting a single catastrophic event, but about managing the constant, rolling wave of risks that defined pre-modern life, proving that sometimes the most powerful form of prediction is simply understanding the rhythm of the world. While the meticulous observation of nature provided one path to prediction, another, more enigmatic approach also captured the medieval imagination, the art of dowsing. Today, we primarily associate dowsing, or water witching, with the search for underground aquifers using a forked branch or a pair of metal rods that supposedly twitch or cross when held over a hidden water source. But in the Middle Ages, the application of this practice was far more ambitious and intriguing. Some practitioners believed that the very same tools, or sometimes pendulums held over maps, could do more than just find water. They could detect unseen geological stresses, acting as a kind of human seismograph to forecast impending earthquakes or the threat of landslides. This method ventured into a shadowy realm where the boundaries between keen observation, heightened intuition, and outright mysticism became fascinatingly blurred. This practice was detailed in curious manuscripts like the Secretum Secretorum, or Book of Secrets, a text falsely attributed to Aristotle that was wildly popular throughout the medieval period. Within its pages, among recipes for invisible ink and advice for rulers, were descriptions of how certain sensitive individuals could use simple tools to perceive forces invisible to the common eye. The dowser would walk slowly across a landscape, holding a Y-shaped hazel rod in their hands, their grip loose, their mind focused and receptive. The idea was that the building tension along a fault line or within an unstable slope would somehow communicate itself through the earth, causing the rod to dip, tremble, or violently twist in the dowser's hand. This was not seen as magic in the modern sense of the word, but rather as a form of sympathetic resonance, a hidden connection between the human body, the tool, and the agitated earth itself. It is crucial to understand that this was not a universally accepted or mainstream science. Many learned scholars of the time were deeply skeptical, dismissing dowsing as superstition or even a form of deception. However, its persistence speaks volumes about the medieval era's remarkably experimental and pragmatic spirit. In a world with no ground-penetrating radar or tiltmeters, communities were willing to explore any and all potential methods that might offer a warning, no matter how unconventional they seemed. If a dowser with a proven local track record claimed to feel a pull from a particular hillside, it was often enough to prompt a village to exercise caution, perhaps avoiding that area or even moving livestock as a precaution. The potential benefit to the community outweighed the lack of a rational explanation. At its heart, the belief in dowsing reflects a profound and poetic aspect of the medieval worldview, the concept that everything in the universe was interconnected by invisible threads of influence and correspondence. The dowser was not seen as a magician, but as a particularly sensitive instrument, a human antenna tuned to receive these subtle vibrations from the natural world. Their skill was considered a rare gift, a form of knowledge that was felt in the bones and the nerves rather than calculated on an abacus. While modern geoscience thoroughly debunks the mechanism attributing the rod's movement to the ideomotor effect, where unconscious muscle movements produce the expected result, the underlying impulse remains deeply human. It was a testament to the relentless desire to feel for the pulse of the planet, to find a way to listen when the Earth itself began to whisper its warnings. This drive to harness every possible tool, from the stars to a simple forked stick, showcases a breathtaking determination to protect their world from the unseen dangers shifting deep below. But the quest to understand nature's warnings was never confined by local geography or isolated tradition. Some of the most profound advances in medieval prediction came not from looking inward, but from reaching outward along the vast, humming networks of trade that connected the world. Routes like the legendary Silk Road were far more than just conduits for silk, spices, and precious gems. They were the information superhighways of their age, carrying a priceless cargo of ideas, stories, and knowledge between the great civilizations of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. A merchant caravan was a living library on the move, and every traveler, from the Venetian trader to the Arab scholar to the Mongol horseman, was a potential bearer of life-saving information, a node in a global network of environmental intelligence. Imagine a European monk hunched over his parchment in a chilly scriptorium, meticulously copying a local weather proverb. His knowledge is deep, but it is provincial, limited to the patterns of his own valley and the records of his monastery's annals. Then, one day, a traveler arrives at the monastery gates, a man who has journeyed from the bustling ports of Alexandria. Over a shared meal, the traveler speaks of a technique used by sailors in the Indian Ocean, who predict the arrival of the monsoon winds by observing the timing of specific star constellations rising just before dawn. For the monk, this is a revelation. It's an entirely new predictive rule, one that correlates celestial movement with seasonal weather in a way he had never considered. He hurries to add this precious gem of information to his growing manuscript, enriching his local database with a global perspective. This was the engine of innovation. Arabic texts on astronomy, which had preserved and greatly expanded upon the learning of the Greeks, began to filter into Europe through centers of translation in places like Toledo, Spain. These works introduced sophisticated star charts and new methods of calculation that refined European astrological predictions. From the East came equally valuable insights. Chinese scholars had maintained detailed, centuries-long records of earthquakes, noting their frequency, intensity, and the specific geological signs that preceded them. When fragments of this knowledge traveled west along the trade routes, perhaps through the accounts of a Jesuit missionary or a Nestorian Christian merchant, it provided European predictors with a much larger dataset. They could now compare the tremor that shook their own town not just to one other local event from 50 years prior, but to a dozen similar events documented on the other side of the world, allowing them to identify patterns on a truly global scale. This cross-cultural dialogue was a powerful force for refinement and skepticism. A European astrologer's claim that a certain planetary alignment always brought storms might be challenged by an Islamic scholar's records showing that in North Africa, the same alignment had consistently coincided with periods of drought. This friction between different traditions didn't create confusion. It fostered a more nuanced and evidence-based approach. predictors were forced to move beyond rigid, local superstitions and to look for universal principles that could be verified across different environments and cultures. They began to build a more robust comparative science of disaster prediction, one that acknowledged the vast complexity of natural systems while still striving to find its underlying order. This remarkable chapter in history underscores a profound truth. Interconnectedness has always been the mother of innovation. Long before the internet created a digital global village, the trade routes of the medieval world had already woven a physical one, where a discovery in a Baghdad observatory or a Beijing archive could, in time, help a village in France prepare for a flood. It highlights the timeless human drive to share knowledge for the collective good, proving that the most vital resource any society has is not what it keeps within its borders, but what it is willing to receive from beyond them. This flow of ideas turned isolated pools of wisdom into a deep, wide ocean of understanding, allowing humanity to face the chaos of nature not as disparate tribes, but as a global community of curious minds. While they meticulously tracked the predictable movements of planets and the steady rhythm of the moon, it was the sudden, unpredictable explosions of light in the night sky that truly seized the medieval imagination with a potent mixture of awe and dread. A meteor shower was not a beautiful astronomical event to be casually observed. It was a rupture in the celestial order, a violent shower of fire from the heavens that could only be interpreted as a dire omen. These atmospheric anomalies, which also included the eerie, shimmering curtains of the aurora borealis seen far to the south of its usual range, were universally seen as divine portents, urgent messages written in a language of fire and light that warned of impending upheaval, whether through war, pestilence, or natural catastrophe. In a world where the stability of the cosmos was directly linked to the stability of society, a sky that appeared to be cracking apart was a vision of absolute terror. Medieval scholars, acting as the official interpreters of these terrifying displays, responded not with panic but with diligent documentation. They became the accident investigators of the celestial realm, carefully recording every detail in their annals and chronicles. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for example, is filled with entries that note the year and specific appearance of these fire-breathing dragons in the sky, meticulously describing their number, direction, and intensity. The goal was to identify patterns, to build a case history that could potentially predict the future. If a brilliant meteor storm was followed by the death of a king and a bloody succession crisis, that correlation was noted. If a particularly vivid aurora preceded a devastating outbreak of plague, the connection was etched into the historical record. Their explanations were, by our standards, supernatural. They saw the hand of God or the mischief of demons in these events, but their methodology was fundamentally empirical. They were gathering data, looking for cause and effect in a universe they believed was governed by a divine and moral logic. A powerful and well-documented example of this is the response to the Leonid meteor storm of 902. This annual shower, which we now know is caused by the Earth passing through the debris trail of the Tempel-Tuttle comet, can sometimes intensify into a breathtaking storm of thousands of meteors per hour. To medieval observers across Europe, this was not a predictable annual event but a shocking, unprecedented bombardment. Chroniclers from regions as distant as Italy and Germany described the night sky as being alive with falling stars, a sight so terrifying that many believed the end of the world was at hand. In the years that followed, these same chronicles recorded a wave of political assassinations, Viking raids of unusual ferocity, and a series of poor harvests that led to famine. For the medieval mind, the connection was undeniable and causal. The heaven-sent fire had heralded the earthly chaos. The meteor storm became a fixed point in history, a benchmark against which future calamities were measured. This relentless curiosity about the skies, even when filtered through a supernatural lens, has left modern scientists an unexpected and invaluable gift. The detailed records kept by those medieval monks and scholars provide us with a rich, long-term dataset that extends our historical understanding of astronomical phenomena far beyond the era of telescopes. By studying these ancient accounts of meteor storms and auroral displays, contemporary astronomers can better calculate the orbits of comets and understand the long-term behavior of solar activity. A chronicler's note about a blood-red glow in the north on a specific night in 1178 helps modern researchers reconstruct historical solar cycles. In this way, the medieval drive to find divine meaning in the atmosphere has inadvertently provided the raw material for 21st century science, creating a fascinating bridge between ancient prophecy and modern astrophysics. Beyond the visible signs in the sky or the tremors in the ground, medieval predictors also cultivated a remarkable sensitivity to the very soundscape of their world, learning to decipher the ominous messages carried on the air itself. In an age free from the constant hum of machinery and urban life, the natural acoustic environment was a rich and telling tapestry of information. A sudden, deep rumble with no obvious source, an inexplicable and profound silence that fell over a forest, or a high-pitched, bell-like tone seemingly emanating from a mountain ridge, these were not dismissed as imagination. They were heard as urgent bulletins, direct auditory warnings from the earth itself that something was dangerously amiss. This reliance on sound represents one of the most intimate and immediate forms of medieval prediction, a testament to their profound attunement to their environment. Historical accounts from monasteries and village chronicles are filled with these chilling descriptions. In regions prone to seismic activity, like the alpine valleys of Italy, there are numerous records of people reporting a low, persistent booming in the days or hours before an earthquake struck. They often referred to these sounds as earth drums, or described them as the distant rumble of a great cart rolling over cobblestones deep underground. Others reported feeling a strange, almost imperceptible vibration through the soles of their feet before their ears could even register the sound, a somatic warning that urged them to move to open ground. In coastal communities, a different acoustic sign was heeded: the sudden absence of sound. Fishermen knew that when the ever-present cries of gulls and other seabirds abruptly ceased, and the waves seemed to fall into an unnatural, eerie hush, a powerful storm was likely gathering force far out at sea, its low-pressure front pushing a blanket of silence ahead of it. Medieval scholars, in their efforts to rationalize these phenomena, developed theories that were ingenious for their time. Lacking any understanding of seismic waves or infrasound, they turned to the principles of natural philosophy available to them. The most common explanation for the subterranean booms was that they were caused by great volumes of air becoming trapped and compressed in vast underground caverns. They theorized that as geological pressures built, these pent-up gases would suddenly burst through fissures in the rock, creating a thunderous explosion deep below the surface. The bell-like tones reported from mountains were often attributed to powerful winds being forced through narrow rocky passages and fissures, much like air blown across the top of a bottle. While these explanations missed the true geophysical mechanics, they were logical attempts to apply observable principles, like the behavior of compressed air and wind, to the mysterious and the unseen. This highly developed auditory vigilance was a powerful and democratic form of technology. It required no special instruments, no literacy, and no social status. It only required a community to be present and listening. The collective ear of a village became its own early warning system. When one person reported a strange noise, others would quickly corroborate, sharing their own experiences and deciding on a course of action. This shared sensory awareness often led to preemptive evacuations, saving countless lives. In essence, their ears were performing the function of our modern seismographs and Doppler radar, detecting the precursor signals of disaster through biological means. It showcases the incredible potential of human perception when it is finely honed by necessity and sharpened by a deep, respectful connection to the natural world. Their ability to act on these subtle sensory cues stands as a powerful reminder that some of the most advanced systems for understanding our planet are the ones we were born with. And then there were the comets, those terrifying, unpredictable visitors that slashed across the medieval sky without warning, their brilliant tails stretching like a celestial accusation. In a universe believed to be orderly and divinely structured, the sudden appearance of a comet was a profound violation, a crack in the fabric of reality that could only signal imminent chaos. Unlike the predictable planets or the steady march of the constellations, a comet was a wild card, an unknown variable that ignited a deep, primal fear. It was seen as a divine portent of the highest order, an unambiguous herald of famine, war, or pestilence sent to shake the very foundations of society. To look up and see one of these long-haired stars was to feel the cold chill of impending doom, a feeling that would ripple through entire kingdoms, from the peasant in the field to the king on his throne. This fear was not born of simple ignorance. It was reinforced by a grim and seemingly reliable correlation with historical tragedy. The most potent example, seared into the European consciousness, was the appearance of Halley's comet in 1066. As the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle starkly recorded, it was a star that appeared with long hair and was seen as raining blood. Its arrival coincided almost perfectly with the Norman conquest of England, one of the most violent and transformative events in medieval history. The comet was universally interpreted as the divine signal foretelling William the Conqueror's victory and the bloody subjugation of the Anglo-Saxon people. But the association went even deeper. Chroniclers across the continent also linked its passing to a period of severe weather, crop failures, and widespread disease that followed. In the medieval mind, the connection was undeniable and absolute. The comet hadn't just preceded the disaster, it had caused it. Yet, amidst this climate of superstitious dread, a more analytical response was also taking root. Brilliant scholars like the 15th century German astronomer and mathematician Regiomontanus began to approach these phenomena with a new spirit of inquiry. While he certainly worked within an astrological framework, he also represented a shift towards meticulous observation and mathematical calculation. He studied the paths of comets across the sky, carefully plotting their positions and movements in an attempt to discern patterns and predict their returns. This was a monumental task, a painstaking effort to impose order on the seemingly chaotic. By attempting to correlate these celestial paths with earthly events, Regiomontanus and his peers were engaging in a primitive form of celestial mechanics. They were striving to bridge the vast gap between sheer, awe-struck terror and rational analysis, seeking to demystify the cosmos by understanding its rules, however imperfectly they were grasped. This work required a sophisticated toolkit of intellect and instrumentation. They used devices like the astrolabe and the torquetum to measure the comet's altitude and trajectory against the fixed backdrop of stars. They recorded its changing appearance, the length and direction of its tail, its brightness, and its duration in the night sky with meticulous detail. These observations were then cross-referenced with historical annals and chronicles, searching for any repeating pattern that could unlock the secret of their timing and meaning. Was a comet that appeared in the constellation of Leo always followed by the death of a king? Did one that passed through Virgo inevitably precede a poor harvest? This was data science on a grand, cosmic scale, an attempt to build a predictive model of the heavens using the only tools they had: patience, mathematics, and the unwavering belief that the universe, in its heart, was orderly and knowable. The legacy of this fraught relationship with comets is a profound one. It stands as a powerful testament to humanity's enduring and dualistic quest to understand the heavens. On one hand, it reveals our deep-seated need to find meaning and causality in the terrifying and the unknown, to weave a narrative that connects the cosmos to our earthly struggles. On the other, it marks the very beginnings of our scientific journey to unravel the true mechanics of the universe, to replace fear with knowledge. Those medieval astronomers, trembling even as they calculated, were the direct precursors to the great minds like Edmund Halley, who would later use those very same historical records to prove the periodic nature of the comet that bears his name. Their fearful observations, born of superstition, became the foundational data for the science of astronomy, reminding us that the path to discovery often begins not in cold detachment, but in a passionate, fearful, and awe-struck engagement with the mysteries above. Beyond the sounds of the earth and the sight of comets, medieval predictors also turned their attention inward to the silent messages their own bodies seemed to broadcast. In an age without barometers or weather apps, people became acutely aware of their physiological state, noticing that their physical well-being often served as a remarkably sensitive indicator of impending environmental change. It wasn't uncommon for chronicles to note that in the days before a severe storm or an earthquake, a strange malaise would sweep through a community. People reported widespread, unexplained headaches, sudden bouts of dizziness, a collective feeling of anxiety or restlessness, and old injuries would ache with a peculiar intensity. These weren't dismissed as mere coincidence. They were read as the body's own early warning system, a direct and intimate response to shifts in the invisible forces of the natural world. This concept was deeply rooted in the prevailing medical theory of the time, the doctrine of the four humors. Pioneering scholars like the Persian physician Avicenna, whose monumental work The Canon of Medicine was a foundational text for centuries, explained health as a delicate balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile within the body. Avicenna and his contemporaries taught that this internal balance was profoundly influenced by the external environment, the quality of the air, the seasons, and even the movements of the planets. They theorized that in the hours before a major storm, for instance, the air pressure would drop and the atmosphere might become heavy with a different, more humid quality. This corrupt air was believed to disrupt the humoral balance, particularly by causing an excess of phlegm, which could lead to that foggy-headed feeling, lethargy, and the aches so many reported. Before an earthquake, they suspected that subtle emissions from the Earth, what we might now identify as gases like radon, could be inhaled, directly poisoning the body and causing dizziness or nausea. This created a powerful holistic world, where the boundary between the self and the environment was beautifully porous. Your personal health was not an isolated event but a conversation with the world around you. A sudden, collective headache in a village wasn't just a medical curiosity, it was a meteorological data point. This knowledge empowered individuals to become active participants in prediction. A farmer feeling a specific, familiar throbbing in his knee might decide to hurry the harvest, trusting his body's signal over a seemingly clear sky. A shepherd noticing his flock was skittish and then himself feeling a wave of unexplained anxiety might drive his sheep to lower ground, acting on a compound signal from both his animals and his own nerves. This was a deeply intuitive form of forecasting, one that encouraged people to heed their own physical sensations as a legitimate and valuable source of information. Of course, by modern standards, their physiological model was fundamentally flawed. We now understand that the aches are likely caused by changes in atmospheric pressure affecting fluid pressure in joints and sinuses, and that gases like radon can indeed be detected by the body, though not in the way they imagined. Yet, for all its inaccuracies, their approach revealed an incredible insight that modern science is only recently beginning to fully appreciate: the profound interconnectedness of human health and planetary systems. Their methods may have been clothed in the language of humors and corrupt air, but they were correctly identifying a very real biological sensitivity to environmental change. This practice reminds us that the most sophisticated instrument for understanding our world is often the human body itself, if we only learn to listen to its ancient, intelligent language. But it wasn't just the body that spoke in this silent language of warning. Sometimes the very air itself seemed to ignite with a mysterious, ethereal light. Imagine the terror and awe of a medieval sailor clinging to the rigging of his ship in the middle of a pitch-black night at sea, when suddenly the mast above him begins to glow with a haunting, blue-white fire. This spectacular phenomenon, known as St. Elmo's fire, was a regular and utterly terrifying encounter for those who braved the oceans. On land, farmers and travelers would sometimes report strange, dancing lights over marshy ground or flickering above a ridgeline hours before the earth began to tremble. In a world without any concept of electricity or plasma, these spectral illuminations could only be interpreted as one of two things: a direct spiritual warning or a profound, yet natural, signal that the atmosphere itself was becoming dangerously unstable. For the deeply religious medieval mind, the interpretation was often steeped in symbolism and divine narrative. Sailors, a particularly superstitious lot, named the mast-top glow after Saint Erasmus of Formia, the patron saint of sailors, seeing it as either a sign of his protection or a frightening omen of his displeasure. The eerie silence of the display, the fact that this fire did not burn wood or singe hair, only added to its supernatural quality. It was a light that seemed to belong to another world. Similarly, the mysterious ground lights, often seen in seismically active regions, were frequently woven into local folklore as restless spirits, will-o'-the wisps luring travelers to their doom, or as the lanterns of demons surveying the land before a catastrophe. This wasn't just fanciful storytelling. It was a framework for understanding the incomprehensible, a way to process a genuinely frightening experience by embedding it within a familiar cultural and spiritual context. Yet, alongside these supernatural explanations, a parallel thread of rational, naturalistic inquiry was also thriving. Scholarly minds, ever curious, sought physical causes for these bewildering sights. Some medieval natural philosophers, drawing on ancient ideas, theorized that they were caused by flammable gases released from the earth, a theory that wasn't entirely incorrect, as swamp gases like methane can indeed ignite. Others, coming closer to the truth, speculated about atmospheric exhalations or dry vapors that somehow became ignited by the agitation of the air itself. While they lacked the terminology of electrical charge and plasma, their descriptions of a fatty and viscous air that could be set ablaze show a remarkable attempt to apply logical reasoning and observation to a seemingly magical event. They were groping toward the modern scientific understanding that St. Elmo's fire is a luminous plasma caused by a corona discharge from a sharp object in a strong atmospheric electric field, typically during a thunderstorm. This knowledge was quickly integrated into the practical, life-saving toolkit of medieval forecasting. For a seasoned sea captain, the appearance of the saint's fire on the masts was not necessarily a cue to pray, but a definitive command to act. It was a highly reliable indicator that the ship was already within the grip of a powerful electrical storm, even if the worst of the winds had not yet arrived. The sight would prompt an immediate and frantic effort to reef the sails, secure the cargo, and prepare the vessel to weather the impending tempest. On land, communities that learned to associate strange ground lights with subsequent earthquakes would treat their appearance with the utmost seriousness, viewing them as a final, visual confirmation to evacuate to safer ground. This willingness to use a bizarre and frightening phenomenon as a practical data point showcases the medieval capacity to blend awe with analysis, to turn fear into an actionable strategy for survival. This attentiveness to these fleeting visual anomalies, whether explained by faith or fledgling science, greatly enriched the tapestry of medieval prediction. It demonstrates a worldview that was exquisitely sensitive to its environment, where every sense was recruited into the service of foresight. They understood that nature's warnings could come in any form, from the behavior of a bird to a pain in a joint to a ghostly light on the mast. By documenting these events and weaving them into their predictive frameworks, they created a multi-layered early warning system that was as diverse and complex as the world they were trying to understand. Their legacy is a powerful reminder that the desire to read the signs in the sky, on the land, and in the very air around us is a fundamental and enduring human impulse, one that drives us to find pattern and meaning even in the most mysterious and electrifying displays. While the appearance of comets was unpredictable and terrifying, another celestial event arrived with clockwork regularity, yet was viewed with nearly equal dread: the lunar eclipse. There is something uniquely unsettling about watching the familiar, gentle face of the moon be slowly consumed by a dark, reddish shadow, a feeling that transcends time. For medieval people, this was not a fascinating astronomical alignment. It was a direct assault on one of the fundamental pillars of the night sky. The moon, a constant symbol of cyclical stability, of tides and time and the rhythms of life, was being attacked, darkened, and seemingly corrupted. This violation of the cosmic order could only mean one thing: a corresponding upheaval was imminent in the earthly realm, a period of political instability, bloody conflict, or devastating natural disasters like earthquakes and famines. The eclipse was a celestial battle, and its fallout would inevitably be felt by humanity. To navigate this terrifying periodicity, medieval astrologers turned to their most sophisticated tools: detailed astronomical tables that allowed them to predict these events with remarkable accuracy years, even decades in advance. Among the most influential were the Toledo Tables, a magnificent work of scholarship compiled in the 11th century that synthesized Greek, Islamic, and Hebrew astronomical knowledge. These tables provided the complex calculations needed to forecast not just lunar eclipses, but also solar ones and the precise movements of the planets. For a skilled astrologer in the service of a king, consulting these tables was like reading a detailed schedule of potential future crises. He could warn his sovereign that a total lunar eclipse would occur in the sign of Scorpio on a specific future date, and that based on historical precedent, this alignment had previously coincided with assassination attempts or violent rebellions. This was not mere guesswork, it was a form of early data science. These scholars engaged in meticulous historical correlation, scouring old chronicles and annals to build a database of disaster. They would note that the eclipse of 1138 had been followed by a bitter civil war, or that the one in 1207 had preceded a catastrophic earthquake in the eastern Mediterranean. By mapping these celestial events onto a timeline of human suffering, they began to identify patterns and astrological signatures for different types of calamity. An eclipse in a water sign like Pisces might portend floods and naval disasters, while one in an earth sign like Capricorn could warn of earthquakes and agricultural collapse. This allowed them to create nuanced predictive models that specified not just that a crisis was coming, but its potential nature and timing. The impact of these forecasts was profound and directly shaped the course of history. A prediction of impending turmoil based on an eclipse could lead a paranoid king to purge his court of suspected rivals, heighten border defenses, or postpone a risky military campaign. On a broader scale, the news of a coming eclipse would filter down to the general populace, often through church sermons that framed the event as a divine warning. This would create an atmosphere of heightened anxiety and preparation. Communities might stockpile extra food, strengthen their fortifications, or engage in public prayers and penance to avert the worst of the predicted disaster. The prophecy, in effect, became a self-fulfilling script that dictated public behavior and political strategy for months surrounding the event. This practice exemplifies the sophisticated medieval blend of precise astronomical observation and potent symbolic interpretation. They had mastered the how of the eclipse, the complex celestial mechanics that caused the Earth's shadow to fall across the moon. Their calculations were a triumph of mathematics and persistent observation. Yet they explained the why through a rich tapestry of symbolism, astrology, and theology. The moon was often associated with queenship, the populace, and the emotional underpinnings of society. Its darkening was seen as an omen for the health of the queen, the mood of the common people, or the stability of the realm. This fusion of the quantifiable and the qualitative was not a weakness in their thinking, but its greatest strength. It allowed them to take cold, hard data and translate it into a narrative that had immediate and powerful meaning for every level of society, from the illiterate farmer to the learned king, transforming astronomical events into urgent calls to action that shaped the destiny of nations. But beyond the meticulous charts of astronomers and the careful observations of naturalists, another powerful current of predictive wisdom flowed through the medieval world, one woven not from data but from story. Folklore and mythology were far more than simple entertainment around a fireside. They were the ancient hard drive of cultural knowledge, encoding vital survival instructions within the captivating frames of dragons, spirits, and gods. When a scholar wrote that an earthquake was caused by a great dragon stirring in its subterranean lair, he wasn't necessarily stating a literal fact. He was using a powerful, shared cultural metaphor to explain a terrifying and inexplicable event, making the science of the day accessible and unforgettable for everyone, from the illiterate farmer to the courtly knight. These stories provided a coherent framework for the chaos of nature, transforming random acts of destruction into narratives with cause and effect, and more importantly, with potential warnings. Medieval writers and scholars understood the immense didactic power of these tales and frequently wove them into their more formal works. The Venerable Bede, in his historical writings, might reference local legends of spirits haunting the coast before a storm to lend weight to his own meteorological observations. This wasn't a sign of ignorance, but rather a clever synthesis of different ways of knowing. A bestiary describing the mythical basilisk, whose glance could kill, might also note that its appearance was traditionally associated with periods of plague and pestilence, effectively using the monster as a symbol for the invisible spread of disease. By embedding these mythological references into scholarly texts, they ensured that the practical wisdom of the common folk was preserved and granted authority, while the raw observations of the educated elite were made relatable and resonant for the entire population. We can see this process clearly in the Norse myth surrounding the trickster god Loki. His monstrous son, Fenrir the Wolf, was prophesied to bring about great destruction during Ragnarok. To prevent this, the gods bound Fenrir with a magical, impossibly strong ribbon called Gleipnir. The myth describes how, once bound, the furious wolf thrashed and struggled so violently that the very earth shook with his efforts. For a Norse community living in a seismically active region, this story provided a perfect, poetic explanation for the terrifying phenomenon of earthquakes. The ground wasn't just moving arbitrarily, it was trembling with the struggles of a bound god-beast. This narrative did more than just explain, it also offered a form of comfort. The earthquakes were part of a known, prophesied story. They were expected, and their occurrence reinforced the cosmic order rather than shattered it. Similarly, in Celtic lore, the banshee served a crucial predictive function. This female spirit was not a mindless horror. Her mournful wailing outside a home was a specific omen, a supernatural telegraph warning of an impending death within the family. While this seems purely supernatural, it likely originated from very real observations. In an era before modern medicine, the final stages of a terminal illness could create a distinct soundscape within a household, a change in the rhythm of activity, specific cries of pain, or the subdued tones of grieving relatives. A stranger hearing these sounds at night might easily interpret them as a singular, unearthly wail. The myth of the banshee codified this observation, turning an auditory clue into a powerful cultural signal that prompted families to prepare, both practically and spiritually, for a loss. It was a way of giving a recognizable face and a story to the intimate and universal experience of death, allowing people to anticipate and process it within a shared narrative framework. The enduring power of these stories lies in their incredible efficiency as vessels for knowledge. A complex geological process is difficult to explain and even harder to remember. But a story about an angry dragon trapped under a mountain is simple, vivid, and sticks in the mind forever. These myths made the science of prediction democratic. You didn't need to read Latin or understand astrological charts to grasp the warning carried in a folktale about water spirits becoming agitated before a flood. This shared mythology created a common language of risk that everyone could speak and understand, ensuring that critical survival information was passed down intact through countless generations around the hearth, in the fields, and at the market. It proves that sometimes the most effective way to prepare for the future is to first learn the stories of the past. For all their remarkable ingenuity, medieval predictors were navigating a world shrouded in profound uncertainty, and their methods, though often insightful, were far from infallible. The very frameworks that gave them a sense of control, astrology, divine interpretation, and symbolic reasoning, were also the source of their most significant errors. A primary weakness was the inherent subjectivity in reading nature's signs. Without standardized instruments or the scientific method to provide objective data, one person's omen could be another's coincidence. A comet might be followed by a plague, reinforcing the belief in a causal link. But what about the dozens of other comets that passed without incident? Those were simply forgotten, a classic case of confirmation bias where only the hits were counted and the misses were quietly ignored. This reliance on cherry-picked, anecdotal evidence meant their predictive models were built on a shaky foundation of selective memory rather than rigorous, repeatable observation. This problem was compounded by the powerful cultural and religious lenses through which they viewed every event, attributing a flood or an earthquake solely to divine punishment, while providing a comforting narrative of cosmic justice, could lead to dangerously misdirected responses. There are numerous accounts from chronicles where, upon a prediction of impending doom, a town's entire effort would be channeled into religious processions, public penance, and fervent prayer, while practical steps like reinforcing levees or moving food stores to high ground were tragically neglected. The disaster, when it inevitably struck, was then seen as evidence that the penance had been insufficient, rather than a failure of physical preparation. This cycle could create a paralyzing fatalism, where human agency was surrendered to the whims of the heavens, and communities became passive recipients of fate instead of active architects of their own survival. Furthermore, the limited scope of their data was a crippling handicap. A monk in an English monastery might have records stretching back a century, which seemed like an immense span of time to him. But to understand the true, long-term cycles of climate or seismic activity, which operate on scales of centuries or even millennia, this was merely a snapshot. They had no knowledge of events on other continents that could provide comparative data. A scholar trying to predict volcanic weather patterns had no concept of the Indonesian eruption that caused them. He was trying to solve a global puzzle with only a few local pieces. This geographical and temporal myopia meant their predictions were often myopic, unable to account for the vast, interconnected systems that truly govern planetary behavior. Perhaps the most damaging consequence of these limitations was the erosion of trust when predictions inevitably failed. Medieval records, such as the letters of frustrated physicians or the logs of merchant guilds, occasionally reveal a simmering skepticism towards astrologers and soothsayers whose dramatic forecasts did not come to pass. A prophecy of a devastating famine that turned out to be a year of plenty could make a community cynical, leading them to disregard legitimate warnings in the future. This credibility crisis highlights the delicate balance they had to maintain. Their authority was based on a perceived ability to provide certainty in an uncertain world, and each failed prediction chipped away at that foundation, potentially leaving people more vulnerable than if they had relied on their own localized, practical wisdom alone. Yet, to judge them by modern scientific standards is to miss the point entirely. Their shortcomings were not a product of ignorance but of context. They were doing the absolute best they could with the intellectual tools and worldviews available to them. Their errors teach us a crucial lesson about the nature of prediction itself, that it is always a conversation between observation and interpretation, and that interpretation is invariably shaped by the cultural beliefs of the time. Understanding these flaws doesn't diminish their achievements. Instead, it allows us to appreciate the immense intellectual journey humanity has undertaken. It sets the stage for the next chapter, where we'll see how the seeds of their careful observation, once planted in the richer soil of modern scientific rigor, would eventually blossom into the sophisticated forecasting systems we depend on today. What's truly remarkable is how many of these medieval methods, once dismissed as mere superstition, have found profound validation in the halls of modern science. Take the observation of animal behavior, for instance. For centuries, stories of pets acting strangely or wildlife fleeing before an earthquake were relegated to folklore. Today, however, the field of ethology, the study of animal behavior, is taking these anecdotes seriously. Scientists are now conducting rigorous studies to understand how creatures might detect the preliminary signs of a seismic event. The leading theory suggests that animals are sensitive to the release of gases like radon or to subtle shifts in the Earth's magnetic field, and they can perceive the initial high-frequency seismic waves that humans cannot. In regions like Japan and Italy, researchers are even exploring the potential of using networks of animal sensors as part of early warning systems, proving that the medieval farmer and the modern biologist are united by the same fundamental observation. This bridge between ancient observation and contemporary science extends even further into the very ground beneath our feet. Modern seismology, with all its advanced technology, still relies on the same basic principle those medieval monks understood: that the Earth gives off signals before it breaks. Today, we use laser-ranging gear and satellite-based interferometry to detect the microscopic bulging of the land along a fault line. We deploy networks of sensitive seismographs to listen for the faint, deep rumbles known as foreshocks. But the core idea is identical to the medieval practice of noting well water changes or strange ground cracks. We are simply listening with more sophisticated ears. The goal remains the same: to decipher the subtle language of the planet and translate it into a life-saving warning. Perhaps the most unexpected gift from the medieval predictors is the treasure trove of data they left behind. Those meticulous monastic chronicles which diligently recorded harsh winters, great floods, and volcanic hazes have become an invaluable resource for modern climatologists and geologists. By studying these pre-instrumental records, scientists can now identify long-term climate patterns, track the frequency of extreme weather events over centuries, and even pinpoint the dates of major volcanic eruptions by correlating the medieval descriptions of years without summer with evidence from ice core samples. This historical data allows researchers to build more accurate models of our planet's behavior, filling in gaps that pure technology cannot reach. The work of those scribes who thought they were recording divine omens now directly informs our understanding of climate change and geological risk. This enduring legacy underscores a timeless and deeply human drive, the relentless quest to protect our communities from the chaos of nature. Our methods have evolved from astrological charts to supercomputers, from watching bird flight patterns to analyzing Doppler radar, but the fundamental impulse is unchanged. Innovation, it turns out, rarely means inventing something entirely from scratch. More often, it means building upon the wisdom of the past, refining it with new tools and deeper understanding. We stand on the shoulders of those medieval scholars, connected to them across the centuries by a shared determination to read the world's signs and ensure our collective safety. Their story reminds us that progress is not a straight line from ignorance to enlightenment, but a continuous conversation with history, where ancient insights can still illuminate the path to a safer future. From the intricate dance of the planets to the restless stirring of livestock, the story of medieval prediction is a profound testament to human ingenuity. These scholars and everyday observers crafted an entire science of foresight without a single modern instrument, relying instead on the most powerful tools we possess: keen observation, deep cultural memory, and an intuitive connection to the natural world. Their legacy is far more than a historical curiosity. It's a rich repository of wisdom that speaks directly to us in an age of climate uncertainty and technological dependency. They teach us that resilience isn't just about having the most advanced technology, but about cultivating a mindset, a way of seeing the world that is attentive, adaptive, and deeply communal. In many ways, our modern approach to disaster prediction represents the magnificent flowering of the seeds they planted. Our global network of satellites, our deep ocean sensors, and our supercomputers running complex climate models are the direct descendants of their astrological charts, tidal observations, and meticulously kept annals. We have simply expanded their methods to a planetary scale, exchanging the forked dowsing rod for satellite-based interferometry and the interpretation of dreams for the analysis of big data. Yet, in our reliance on these incredible technologies, we risk losing the very skills they so brilliantly honed: the ability to read the subtle, local, and immediate signs that technology can sometimes miss. The medieval world reminds us that the most sophisticated system is a hybrid one, where cutting-edge data is complemented by on-the-ground human awareness. This is their most urgent lesson for today: As we face increasing climate volatility, reconnecting with their holistic perspective is not a step backward, but a vital step forward. It's about remembering to listen to the wisdom of a farmer who can smell rain on the wind, to heed the community elder who remembers the flood patterns of 60 years ago, and to value the shared knowledge that exists outside of digital databases. Their story is a call to re-enchant our relationship with the planet, to see the environment not as a series of data points to be mastered, but as a complex communicative partner. By blending their timeless attentiveness with our powerful tools, we can build a future that is not only smarter but also wiser, more resilient, and more deeply connected to the world we inhabit. Thank you for joining this journey back in time to uncover the secrets of medieval foresight. If you found these insights fascinating, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations into the hidden corners of history. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What aspect of their predictive methods did you find most surprising? Share your reflections in the comments below. Stay curious, keep exploring, and never forget that sometimes the most profound solutions are found not by looking ahead, but by understanding the wisdom